Untitled First Aid. My name is TRINA LUECKHOFF. I'm joined here by Dr. Weiner, who's the Director of Addiction Services at Linden Behavioral Health. Thank you. So if you can tell us a little bit about what your role is at Linden Oaks as Director of Addiction Services.
Absolutely. So as the Director of Addiction Services, I oversee the strategic direction of the addiction service line at both our inpatient detox unit that we have at the main hospital, and then we also have our 5 outpatient clinics where we do chemical dependency and dual diagnosis work. So I oversee that, and then I also do a lot of community outreach. I give a lot of presentations, interact with municipal and state government officials, really try to spread the word about what the science is behind addiction, what the public needs to know about topics that are affecting them these days, or one of which we're going to talk about, and just trying to raise general understanding.
Great, thank you. It's interesting because the topic that we're having you discuss today is the legalization of recreational marijuana. And specifically in June, Illinois passed the legislation to effective on January 1, be able to legalize marijuana recreational use in Illinois. So I'm sure our viewers will have many questions about the topic, and so we can kind of dive right into what you think about this legislation being passed and the impact it potentially has on our teen population specifically.
Yeah, well, so this is a change that I was actually very outspoken about in the fact that I think that it was done in a poor way. The way that it's being rolled out is that it's really focusing on business. You could talk a lot about social justice, you could talk a lot about criminal justice reform, but that's actually different than setting up a commercial enterprise that makes money off of selling THC products to as many people as possible. Legalizing personal use and possession and legalizing sale are actually two separate things. And so the commercial side of it was something that I was very concerned about, in part because when you increase access to a product, when you normalize the use of a product, when you make it mainstream, more people use it. And that's what we're seeing nationwide in the states that have legalized, is that particularly actually within adults, we do see more of them use.
Okay, great. Do you feel like with the legalization of marijuana, it's going to be age 21 or older, but the impact is still going to affect our teen population?
Absolutely. Well, there's a number of concerning elements about taking a drug and making it newly mainstream and kind of putting our societal stamp of approval on saying, if we get intoxicated with this, it's okay. One of them is, just like alcohol, it's not like people under 21 don't drink. And what we're going to start seeing is that just like people use fake IDs to purchase alcohol, just like people get their older siblings or older classmates if they're in college, for example, to buy these products for them, we're going to start seeing the same thing happening with marijuana. Additionally, beyond that, there's been a lot of variables that tend to push it towards a high likelihood that we're going to see an increase in younger person, for like teenagers, use. One of them is that one of the most foundational pivots of drug use with young people is perceived risk versus usage rates. And so when you see a drug as being less risky to use, you tend as a society to use it more. And that's why when you look at some of the tropes coming out of our young people's mouths, things like marijuana is just a plant. Isn't it medicine anyway? It's going to be legal on January 1st. It's not such a big deal. Those are the sorts of things that encourage more of them to use than they otherwise would. The other part that's concerning about it is that the Monitoring the Future study out of the University of Michigan, they just published data a year ago where they asked young people, if marijuana was legalized in your state for use 21 and up, would you be more likely to use it? And what they found was that 25% of high school seniors said, yes, I would either try it if it were legalized, or I would use more than I already am. And that's very concerning.
I mean, 25%, when you think about the entire population of potentially one high school class, people don't think 25% is really high, but in most, it's 5% is too high. Keeping these young kids off of drugs and substances so easily, so early in their life, it has a greater impact on their mental health as they get older. Can we talk a little bit about, the impacts of marijuana use in a teen brain when they start using so early?
Well, and that's particularly concerning. So marijuana actually And there's been numerous brain studies that show this. It actually changes the shape of your brain as you grow if you're using it in your teenage years. In two areas in particular. One is the hippocampus. That's the area of your brain that's associated with memory formation. So your ability to learn is directly impacted by this in a permanent structural way. The other part that about 50% of brain imaging studies found a structural change in over time was the prefrontal cortex. That's the area right in the front of your brain that's in charge of what we call executive functioning. This is your ability to see lots of things and process them at once, to think abstractly, to plan, things that are very important for success in life. And so when you look at these young people who are going to see these societal influences, they're going to see the change in policy, it encourages them to do it because it's saying this is an okay thing. They model us, right? And if adults are using it at a greater clip, if we're putting our legislative stamp of approval on getting high for fun, that trickles down. And
Right.
It has an impact.
So as part of like the mental health curriculum, which I teach, and specifically I'm kind of passionate about teaching the youth curriculum because I have a young person and at any given time I could be surrounded by young people that I think I could be impactful in helping. One of the risk factors we talk about in almost all of the different mental health disorders is keeping these young kids off of drugs or using substances at such an early age and the impact it has on their overall health. So there are many risk factors involved in different mental illnesses, but specifically I always think that parents hone in on, the medication and different illicit drugs to kind of keep those young kids off of drugs so that their mental health status as they grow up is not affected.
It will absolutely, and it puts them on a trajectory that's less successful in life. What we know about marijuana use amongst young people is that high schoolers who use it are less likely to get better grades, they have a lower graduation rate, and actually the same is true for college. People tend to drop out more, not attend class as much, and even if you project that out, we have studies that show that lifetime earning potential goes down based on how much marijuana somebody uses. For a number of reasons. If they start young, we already talked about the brain scans, but also generally speaking, if people are hanging out, if they select themselves into a crowd of people who get high for fun, that's probably not the group of people who are staying late to study at the library on Saturday nights. It's a different social structure that you put yourself into. And so there's a number of reasons why marijuana, or honestly any intoxicating substance, heightens the risk factors for a child not achieving their greatest potential in life. It's just not an ideal decision. And I want to make one more point while we're on this. Sometimes things that I hear a lot when we're talking about marijuana legalization is like, well, we already have alcohol, or we already have all of these other things. Why not do this too? And I think it's really important to note that for me personally, I would be outspoken against any policy change that encouraged any sort of drug use, alcohol, methamphetamine, cocaine, any of it. It just so happens that right now we are advancing a policy and a societal change that is increasing the use rate, intoxication rate, and addiction rate of this substance in particular. And that's critically important. It would be the same for anything. It's just right now marijuana has the industry behind it.
Okay. This is a very interesting topic. We just need to take a short break and we'll be back to discuss it more later. Thank you.
Caring for a family member can be challenging and lead to countless questions for them and for you. Find articles, tips, and tools from experts and others who have been in your place. The Caregiving Resource Center at aarp.org/caregiving.
Let me tell you about the toughest guy on earth. He does the work of 2 jobs, but only gets paid for one. Caregiving is tougher than tough. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back to Mental Health First Aid. We're again joined by Dr. Aaron Weiner. We're going to talk a little bit more about the recreational use of marijuana in the state of Illinois, and specifically we want to talk a little bit about how to recognize signs and maybe symptoms that a young person might be using marijuana.
Yeah, so it's trickier these days than it used to be. So in the past, when people were smoking marijuana all the time, there was a very distinct smell. And certainly that's still there now if someone's using the flower. Now, however, when they're putting it in the vape pens and they're putting it in cartridges and things like that, the smell is much less prominent or not even really there at all. And so it's much more difficult than it used to be in terms of longer, or rather in the short term. is your child using this? Of course, there's still the red eyes that you could look for. If someone's impaired or they're high, you could notice some different behavioral changes or some motor changes. Obviously, it also stimulates appetite, so if it seems like your child is eating a lot more. But honestly, in terms of marijuana, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's different than a lot of the other symptoms that we look for if your child is getting involved in this sort of behavior. And that has a lot to do with things like changes in their mood, changes in their friends, changes in their clothing. If you're in tune with your child and you kind of know how they normally act and you know the people they're normally with, if this starts to change for them and they start using substances of any sort, you generally start to notice changes in their behavior in ways that, again, if you're keyed in, you can see.
So what kind of sleep, would they have a sleep disruption with marijuana usage?
Potentially, although less so even than the sleep, I would say it would be when they're coming home. So if a child is using substances, they have to take the time to buy it, use it, potentially recover from the high or not be drunk anymore if they're off doing it. And so it actually takes a lot of their time, and you'll oftentimes see that either in when they're coming home at night, you'll find out that they weren't attending their after-school activities or they were gone in the middle of the day. If you know where your child is supposed to be and they have a relatively scheduled life, they have a lot harder of a time making the time to obtain, use, and recover from the substance. So I wouldn't necessarily look at it as much of are they waking up in the middle of the night and more when are they coming home at night.
Okay. You don't think it disrupts their sleep in any, like they sleep more or they sleep less in terms of the impact it may have on, that type of behavior?
I wouldn't necessarily think that the sleep in particular is what I would cue in on. I think there's a lot of reasons why kids might sleep more or less, particularly in this day and age with the anxiety that a lot of kids have around school. There's a lot of different factors that could get at the sleep specifically. When you're trying to say, is something going on with my child? Really the question, there's this large constellation of things from their social identity, with who they're hanging out with how they represent themselves, with the time that they spend, where their money's going. There's a lot of different pieces you could put together. Any one of them in and of themselves might not indicate a drug problem, but when you put a lot of different pieces together, struggling at school, mood changes, all of those things, you put it all together and that's the best way to tell.
Okay. Can you tell me a little bit about maybe if somebody was caught driving under the influence of, marijuana, and what would the impact be?
Well, that's a big concern too. So I was at a high school actually. It was about a year ago now, but the assistant principal was telling statistics on their senior class. And what he found was that 38% of their high school seniors, 4 in 10, almost 1 in 5, had either driven high or been in a car with a high driver. And that is very concerning if you care about the health of our children, because there's a huge disconnect between the understanding that you should not drive drunk because that is dangerous and impairing, and that you should not drive high, which is also dangerous and impairing. We actually know that it affects your ability to control your vehicle laterally, to judge speed, to see everything on the road, as well as your reaction time. And it can persist for a long time. And this is one of the biggest issues with marijuana. So with alcohol, your blood alcohol concentration corresponds to a level of impairment where an officer could test for it, you could test for it. We have ways of telling. With THC, although there's been an amount suggested in the blood of 5 nanograms per liter, in the scientific community, we know that it means nothing, because actually most THC goes out of your blood and into your brain within 90 minutes. It's what's called a lipophilic substance. It's attracted to fat. And your brain is about 70% fat. It's like a big blob of fat. And so what happens is that someone will take it, it will go into their brain. We have no way of detecting how impaired they are. There's no objective way with biomarkers for them to test how impaired they are. And then people actually metabolize it at different rates too. And for some people, we have actually found impairment 24 hours after using a substance. Or rather after using marijuana. And so, although not everyone might be impaired 24 hours later, that has significant implications on road safety. The last part I want to make sure I touch when we're talking about marijuana, THC products, and road safety are edibles. things usually sweets like brownies or cakes or lollipops or gummy bears, things like that, that are infused with THC. And that's even an additional problem, because when you take an edible, not only can you not control how much is going to go into your body, other than if it's accurately labeled on the milligrams of THC. With a joint, for example, when you're as high as you want to be, you stop. Or you take shorter puffs, or you can kind of control how high you get. With an edible, it's going in. So if someone's made it themselves, or if you've taken too much, that's a big problem, because you can't slow down. And the other element with driving is that because you're absorbing it through the stomach, as opposed to the lungs, which have a lot more surface area, it goes in slower. You have to absorb it through food, you have to absorb it through your stomach. So some people won't know how high they're going to get until hours after they take their edible. And then additionally, some people who are less used to using THC products might take an edible and be like, well, that didn't work. And then they'll have another. And then in fact, actually, they've now taken far too much, and there's consequences for that.
Can taking an edible have a longer effect on how long it's in your system?
Yeah, so actually, when you smoke a joint or when you vape it, it goes in very, very quickly. Within minutes, you're going to be feeling the full effect. With an edible, actually, the peak blood THC concentration is about 2 hours after ingestion. So it's a much slower ramp up, because again, it's going into your body much slower. Just like with alcohol, drinking on an empty stomach hits you very quickly, versus if you have food in there, it has to filter through the food.
On a related note, I've heard a rumor that marijuana is not addictive. And if you asked many teenagers and many adults that have used it in the past, or are currently using it, plan on using it far into the future, that it's not addictive. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a misconception that I think has been pushed out by the industry to, as I mentioned earlier, lower perceived risk. So we know from the CDC that 1 in 10 adults who uses marijuana develops a use disorder, and 1 in 6 young people. It's actually the second most common substance we see at our rehab facilities at Linden Oaks for chemical dependency, second only to alcohol for adults. And for young people, it's actually the first. The most common substance we see. And we've actually had a verifiable physiological addictive syndrome that we've seen in both animal models and humans for at least 15 years. So there's really no debate or controversy about this in medicine or addiction medicine. It's absolutely addictive. I think why people have this perception is either they look at their own experience, and the majority of people who use don't become addicted. So it would be very easy to look around and say, well, this doesn't happen. It's a lot stronger now than it used to be. So THC used to be about 3 to 4% in your average flower. Now the average is about 21%, and it can go all the way up to 30. So one of today's joints is like lighting up 7 Woodstock pot joints at the same time and smoking them. And the more THC in these products, the greater the consequences. So absolutely, it is addictive, and I would definitely want our viewers to understand that.
Okay, we're probably going to have more on that topic. We just need to take a short break, and we'll be back shortly.
Caring for a family member can be challenging and lead to countless questions for them and for you. Find articles, tips, and tools from experts and others who have been in your place. The Caregiving Resource Center at aarp.org/caregiving.
Let me tell you about the toughest guy on earth. He does the work of 2 jobs, but only gets paid for 1. Caregiving is tougher than tough. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Okay, welcome back to Mental Health First Aid. We're going to continue on the conversation of recognizing the signs of when an individual might become addicted to marijuana. So if you can talk to us a little bit about what that looks like in both a teen and as an adult.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that the process is going to look pretty similar, although maybe the social mechanisms are different. So when people start using an intoxicating substance like this, sometimes in the beginning it starts out social. So it's something that the people around you are doing, that your peers are doing, and so it's something where to fit in and to be part, you do it. And the thing about intoxicating drugs is that sometimes alcohol, marijuana, anything, is that oftentimes it feels good to use them. And so you start using it oftentimes in these social situations. However, though, at a certain point, it's something that you start doing a lot in social situations, like on a daily or near daily basis, and then you maybe start doing it on your own. And at some point, people tend to start using it to deal with their problems. And that's one of the big pivots in when something starts going from something that's just a treat or for fun to something that starts becoming problematic, is if a substance is how you cope with the problems in your life, be it depression or anxiety, a bad marriage, trauma, whatever it is, that starts to become an issue. Because these substances, when you take them over and over and over again, you develop a tolerance. And at a certain point, you also go over what we call a trigger point, where your body then starts to crave it. And if you don't have it, you start going into withdrawal. And so the process of addiction for folks oftentimes comes on slowly, but it's, again, some point along the way, its purpose changes, and it starts becoming something that you feel like you need rather than something that you want. And then even when there's certain elements of your life that start having problems in it may be your social life, or your relationship with loving people in your life, interfering with your work, your bank account, your health, something illegal, maybe even like driving under the influence of a substance, you'll keep doing the behavior, you'll keep using the substance even though it's causing these profound problems. And that, when you really look at the big kind of like back off again and like, when does somebody have a problem? We look at it from 3 different perspectives. One is, how much are you using? Because generally you do use quite often and a lot if you have a problem. The second is, do you have control over it over a long period of time? Like if you said, I could stop doing this for 3 months, no problem, and then do it. That's another one. And then the last one is consequences. And is it causing problems, and do you stick with it anyway?
So you mentioned a little bit about the withdrawal. So if somebody doesn't have a substance in their body, they're going to go through an obvious withdrawal. The same thing with alcohol, with individuals who maybe quit smoking. What would the withdrawals physical be with withdrawing from marijuana usage?
People generally tend they have trouble sleeping, actually. The sleeping gets disrupted. They feel a little bit edgy. Sometimes anxiety gets a little bit higher. Headaches are another pretty common one. Just feeling very off, generally for maybe like a week or so, I would say. Maybe longer than that, depending on how long you've been using. Okay,
and so the period of that 7 days, somebody might want to medicate themselves again with marijuana to make sure that they feel better. And but if they don't use within that 7 days and continue not to use, will they have any physical cravings for marijuana?
Well, and again, any intoxicating substance will work this way. Yes, you'll have cravings if your body develops a tolerance to it and an addiction to it. Basically, it's going to feel, what a craving is it's like an urge in your body. Like if you're hungry or thirsty or you have to urinate, where it feels like it's going to get worse and worse and more powerful unless you respond to it. And the difference with substances, marijuana included, is that it doesn't work that way. And in fact, if you kind of get out of your mental cycle where you're thinking about it, where if you put your mind somewhere else, you engage in something different, that urge will actually go away. But working through those cravings is one of the key skills that you need to learn how to do if you want to get off of a substance and stay off of that substance.
And you mentioned like treatment or like maybe going through some therapy options. What would be kind of the therapy options regarding like somebody using, or you're concerned about a loved one who might be using too much marijuana, and what could be the treatment options for that individual?
Yeah, well, so the bad news is that we don't actually have any FDA-approved medications for marijuana addiction right now. Well, we do have them for alcohol, we do have them for opioids. There's some off-label ones that we're looking at for marijuana, but nothing yet. So really what you're looking at are the psychosocial options, like what we provide at Linden Oaks, where you work on your coping skills, essentially. So how do you deal with those problems that you were self-medicating away with the marijuana? How do you cope with the cravings themselves? How do you get through that? And then also there's a lot of work on the social side of things, because generally if you've become addicted to a substance, you're usually surrounded by people who are using it the same way that you are and could then pull you back into your previous patterns. Or you've really burned bridges with healthy people in your life because of your use. And so there's this big process where you have to learn how to put up boundaries between yourself and unhealthy people in your life, and then also either rebuild bridges with the people who you've pushed away, or find new, healthier connections to make to support you in the new direction that you're taking in your life.
So you did mention at the beginning medications, and can there be an assumption made on the withdrawals from marijuana versus the withdrawals from opioids, and is it more powerful? And that's why there hasn't been necessarily the component of people, the scientific studies behind it, or the need for medication to help manage this kind of withdrawal. Is it more powerful with a different substance, or is it as physiologically as powerful?
It's interesting. So they're different, and I would say that the opioid ones are a lot stronger, all things considered. The drug is also a lot more deadly, and I think that's been when you look at why have we had more of the innovation and the work around opioids, it's because those are killing people at a very rapid clip. And although we've seen plenty of deaths with marijuana in terms of fatal accidents on the road. There was just a headline I saw about a month ago from USA Today where a 17-year-old died from dehydration secondary to cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, which is a syndrome you develop when you take in too much THC, where you have severe abdominal pain and you can't stop vomiting. And so he literally vomited himself to death. We see that happen, but it's nowhere near the scale that we've seen with the opioid epidemic. And so I think that's a big part of the reason why more of the attention has been pivoted that way. Maybe what we'll see if marijuana, if the industry continues to grow, if we see these use rates continue to escalate, maybe we will start to see more innovation in the marijuana treatment angle. What I will say though, and this is anecdotal, just what we see in our treatment clinics, marijuana is second only to opioids in terms of difficulty to quit. For a number of reasons, one of them being that it's so available, and it's going to be even more so now that we're commercializing it, but also there's this idea that it's kind of like a second-class addiction, or not as big of a deal, even though, again, in treatment we see it destroy people's lives just like any other drug does.
So in the previous segment, we talked about the different options for ingesting marijuana. And you mentioned edibles, but I think in the teen population, and I would venture a guess even in the adult population, it's going to be pretty popular to vape this substance because it has this odorless component. So do you think that is something that we have a heightened concern about?
Yeah, no. So in the addiction medicine world, this is a huge problem. So the most potent THC products are the most dangerous. And previously, if you're going to dab, you had to use this basically like bong apparatus with something called a nail, and then actually like a blowtorch to consume these substances, which can be up to 95, I've even seen a 98% pure THC concentrate. Now, you can just put it in a vape pen, and it makes it very accessible. And actually, these concentrates are one of the fastest growing markets. And additionally, it's very worth mentioning that we have this epidemic going on right now with deaths and hospitalizations across the country. At the time we're filming this, at the end of October, we're up to 36 deaths nationwide and 1,600 confirmed hospitalizations of a very severe vaping-related lung illness. 80% of them are coming from THC vapes, and it's not just black market ones. I know that we're talking a lot about that, and they're concentrated more in that area, but multiple deaths in Oregon have been linked to THC products that have come from dispensaries. So right now, vaping any substance, but particularly THC, is a very risky thing to do, in my opinion, and particularly when it comes to THC. You've got to be very, very careful about vaping that. This
is a really interesting topic. We'll probably have to have you back to discuss more. If you guys are interested about learning more, you can always go to our Healthy Driven website to learn more about it. Thank you.
Caring for a family member can be challenging and lead to countless questions for them and for you. Find articles, tips, and tools from experts and others who have been in your place. the Caregiving Resource Center at aarp.org/caregiving.